August 3rd, Gene McGuire.
Depend on yourself and limit your future. Depend on God and miracles happen. Gene McGuire blocked out the clang of cell doors, the roar of voices, the jingle of keys and locks. Prison noise no longer fazed him. Gene's life sentence had begun when he was a sophomore in high school. So for most of his life, his home had been a prison cell, and it would likely be for the rest of his life. His appeals for a reduced sentence had been repeatedly rejected. Thankfully, it was Sunday. Gene pulled on the approved white t-shirt. Then he grabbed his Bible and he sat on the metal stool attached to the small metal desk. He turned to a particular passage, Isaiah 51:14, where it says, "He who is bowed down shall speedily be released." "Bow low," said the Holy Spirit. Gene knelt by the desk. "No, lower." Gene leaned forward till his forehead touched the concrete. "No, lower." To keep his white shirt clean for church, Gene supported his chest with his hands as he stretched out on the floor. "Lift your hands," said the Holy Spirit. Gene obeyed. All of his weight, legs, torso, head, pressed into the cold, hard concrete. "That's how I want you to live," said the Lord, "totally dependent on me. If you depend on yourself, you can have only what you can get. If you depend on me, you can have what I can give." Later, as Gene entered the prison chapel, the Holy Spirit spoke again. "Sit up front. Don't serve today." "But Lord," he thought, "I'm supposed to pass out hymnals." As an elder, Gene helped with Sunday services. "No, sit." Gene sat for the whole service. As the worship band closed with an old hymn, Gene sang along, "I surrender all." "Go to the altar and kneel and sing to me," the Lord said. Gene frowned. What would everyone think? But he went. When he knelt, God's presence caused him to sob. Gene felt a hand on his back. Bowed before the Lord, he worshiped. "Brother Gene," the pastor said, "come and close in prayer." When Gene stood, he was stunned. Behind him were about 150 guys on their knees. The Spirit whispered, "I am looking for one man to be obedient." Gene lived another 2 years of his life sentence. Then, despite strong recommendations and a powerful resume, his 5th request for commutation was denied. Gene cried. He told God he was grieved, hurt, and he was confused. God said, "I will release you, Gene. It's not going to be based on what you have done or who you know. I'm going to release you." 2 months later, Gene received a letter from an attorney. Due to a recent Supreme Court decision, Gene had a right to an appeal. At first, Gene ignored the letter. He had suffered so many disappointments, but the Holy Spirit nudged him, and the process began. On April 3rd, 2012, a black-robed judge called a crowded courtroom to session, and Gene fought for slow, calming breaths. Shackled and handcuffed to a chain around his waist and wearing the bright orange shirt of an inmate, Gene awaited resentencing. Finally, the judge said, "The defendant shall rise." Gene had been in prison since he was 17, 34 years, 9 months, and 15 days. The judge declared his sentence was served. The courtroom exploded. Gene collapsed into his chair and sobbed. Someone shouted, "Unshackle that man. Release him from those chains. He is a free man." Then, as the guard was unlocking the shackles that had held him for so long, his sister was desperately trying to reach him. The guard turned to her and said, "Give me just a moment." And she said, "I've waited for 34 years. I can't wait another moment." In Pennsylvania, 479 juveniles were imprisoned, sentenced to a life without parole. But Gene was the first who, without parole or probation, was freed. When Gene bowed low, God fast-tracked Gene's liberation. Who do you routinely depend on? Depend on yourself and limit your future. Depend on God and miracles happen.
Amen. Chuck Stecker here. I'm the teaching pastor at Summit Church in Centennial, Colorado. I'm also the executive director of A Chosen Generation. You know, August 3rd, the story of Gene McGuire. This is one of those stories that when I read this, there was a couple of times I just needed to stop and really begin to process what was taking place. I want to focus on one thing in today's challenge. It would be easy to focus on the mistake. He was released, free that man, unshackle him. But here's the question I want to focus on. All of this began when Gene McGuire heard the voice of God. You know, it's one of the things that we've been studying at our church, and one of the things that I've been talking about but working on is, how often do you take time to hear the voice of God? Some of you may say, I've never heard the voice of God. And you know what? That doesn't surprise me. But what I am suggesting to you is it because he's not speaking, or is it because you're not quiet enough and listening? That's really the question. Many years ago, the story of David Youngie Cho, and long short of the story was several pastors asked him, when he had asked them how much they pray, and very frustratingly, they said, well, how long do you pray? How often do you pray? And he said, about 4 hours a day. And one of the pastors says, good grief, man. What can you say in 4 hours? And with an astonished look, David Youngie Cho looked at him and said, say, most of the time, I'm just listening. Here's my challenge. Would you be willing to set a watch, a clock, your phone, and say, give me 3 minutes without thinking about anything, without processing, and see if you can actually do that. Because until we can listen to the voice of God, we're not going to hear the voice of God. Gene McGuire being released began because he was obedient to the voice of God. God bless you.